Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 6th of March of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with the Kupyansk front line. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours, as a result of artillery duels or artillery strikes from the Russian side, the Ukrainians lost 45 soldiers and something around 5 armored vehicles. There are no changes on the ground, just the local artillery duels. Now let's talk about Liman frontline. The Ministry of Defense reported that, as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 160 soldiers and 12 armored vehicles, including one tank, and also the Ukrainians lost one artillery system. As you can see, there are no changes on the ground as well. The Russians continue still support offensive operation to slow down and to pin down the Ukrainian forces and not to allow them to redeploy the reserves from Liman front line in direction of Bakhmut. Now let's talk about Bakhmut. Today we got a lot of very interesting updates about Bakhmut. The Ministry of Defense reported that during the previous 24 hours, as a result of clashes all over the Donbas front line, the Ukrainians lost 225 soldiers, 23 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems. Furthermore, as a result of artillery duels, the Russians destroyed the ammo depot of 55th Air Artillery Brigade that located in the vicinity of Bakhmut. And also the Russians destroyed another radar INT-PQ-37 that Ukrainians were using to spot and discover the Russian artillery systems. So now let's discuss Bakhmut in more details, because this morning we received a very interesting piece of news from the Ukrainian sources. Zelensky made some kind of meeting between Zelensky, the head of Ukrainian army, and the head of infantry army, whose main job these days is to defend Bakhmut. And that was his idea, his idea of the head of Ukrainian infantry army to protect Bakhmut and not to step back from this town. So this piece of news was published by the website of President of Ukraine, and according to information they published, these three persons, the head of Ukrainian army, the head of infantry army, and the president of Ukraine, took a decision to continue defense operation of Bakhmut and not to step back from this town. When talking about the Russians, they're saying that as a result of the progress on the ground, the Russians established 100% control over the eastern part of Bakhmut. Now the front line goes along the river Bakhmutka on the east, and let's say this small part of the river that located on the south of Bakhmut as well. So this is the current situation. As you can see, the Russians control more than 40%. So we can say that maybe the Russians have already established control over the 50%. The Ukrainians, when talking about the Ukrainians, what are they doing right now? They're trying to increase the channel between Chasov Yar and Bakhmut by doing small counter-offensive operation in the south in the vicinity of Ivanovska. They're trying to push the Russians back and to increase the channel and to increase the possibilities of this channel for movements and redeployment of the forces. This is about the tactics. Furthermore, the Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of artillery duels, the Russians discovered the warehouses of 55th Artillery Brigade and attacked them, and this destroyed them. Those brigades were destroyed in the small town by the name of Dachne. And this is as you can see, there are two same titles of two villages, Avdiivka and Avdiivka. But if we take a look at the Russian sources map, you're gonna see that this town has the name of Dachne, this one. So the Russians destroyed the warehouses and ammo depots of 55th Artillery Brigade in this area. So that means that the Ukrainians were using the New York-Toretsk agglomeration, these positions, to deploy their artillery systems and to pin down or to make counter-artillery duels with the Russians from this area. The Russians were attacking, as we discussed yesterday, this square. They were trying to destroy every single unit that were trying to use these fields for evacuation. And as we know, this is the only possible road for the Ukrainians for evacuation. And the Russians are able to deploy their artillery systems all over the front line, starting from the south and ending from the north-south. So somewhere on the right side of this arrow, the Russians were able to deploy their artillery system and to attack the Ukrainians in this area. And what kind of decision took the Ukrainians to prevent all these Russian artillery attacks and to reduce the artillery possibility of the Russians? They deployed their 55th Brigade, or they moved on position, the Ukrainians' 55th Artillery Brigade in the vicinity of Toretsk, and they were trying to attack the Russians from the south, and they were trying to reduce the area that the Russians are able to use for artillery duels. Those artillery systems were spotted and attacked by the Russians, and one more time, as a result of those attacks, this 55th Brigade lost at least one ammo depot. I'm not sure about the north position, but I believe that there are also artillery positions somewhere here, and from these positions the Ukrainians are trying to attack the Russians from the north. There were no updates about any progress from the Ukrainian side about the artillery systems. From the Russian side, they didn't report anything. They haven't reported any piece of information about destroyed ammo depot artillery systems, just the global number that Ukrainian lost just 2 artillery systems, one Uragan and one D-30 howitzer in the vicinity on Donetsk front line. So this is about artillery duels. So as you can see, the situation also in Russian favor. We will come back to that meeting with Zelensky and the head of Ukrainian armies about the decision to continue defense operation. This is a very important decision. This is a very important piece of information, piece of news. But before that, let's discuss and let's discover the losses. Ukrainian losses according to the Russian sources in more details. So the Russians reported that the Ukraine lost 225 soldiers. So this is a very high number, but this is the same number as we see yesterday and the day before yesterday. So we can see that there is a very high intensivity of clashes, but with one important difference with the previous days. There are no movements on the ground. Just the eastern part, the Russians established control, but not because of heavy clashes. I believe, and most of the sources confirms, that Ukrainians took a decision to step back from the eastern part of Bakhmut, and I believe that the Russians entered without even clashes or something like this, or the clashes was the intensivity of clashes were very low on the eastern part. So the Russians haven't improved any progress on the ground, but the losses are still very high. And now let's talk about the losses among armored vehicles. And today the structure of losses among armored vehicles has been changed. The thing is that the Ukrainians lost 23 armored vehicles during the previous 24 hours, and we discussed that. The Ukrainians are using light automobiles for evacuation, for rotation, and so on. But the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost just 9 light vehicles. And this is the lowest level of light vehicles that Ukrainians lost since the, let's say, the blockade of Bakhmut. And also the Russians added that Ukrainians lost 5 infantry armored vehicles and 5 fighting armored vehicles. So this is a very heavy armored vehicles, very heavy vehicles that Ukrainians can use, let's say, in offensive operations to support battles in town. And the Ukrainians lost 14 of such types of weapon. And this is very expensive and very important types of weapon. So what does it mean? If we analyze this number, we can make a lot of conclusions, but something tells me that starting from today, the Ukrainians took a decision to move armored vehicles from Bakhmut, or at least to make a few attempts of doing this. But as we can see, all those, maybe they managed to move a lot, but we see that they also have lost a lot of armored vehicles of that types on the Bakhmut front line. It's the same like Bradley or Striker if we compare these types of armored vehicles with the Western weapon. So very powerful and very necessary for the Ukrainian army. And that means that at the first stage of retreating from Bakhmut, the Ukrainians moved first. They moved the most mobile and important and the most powerful, well-trained, experienced troops or infantry or forces of special operation, manpower. So during the first days, the Ukrainians were trying to move the manpower. Now the Ukrainians, this is the second stage of retreating from Bakhmut, took a decision to move from Bakhmut armored vehicles, and but now let's try to analyze, let's try to compare, try to understand this retreat process from Bakhmut with the words of Zelensky and the head of Ukrainian army Zaluzhny about the fact, and the head of infantry army, that they're planning to continue defense operation of Bakhmut. And we can also make a lot of conclusions. There are a lot of options what is happening these days. And first of all is, and one of the obvious option is that the Ukrainians are no longer able to step back from Bakhmut because they're completely encircled. They are in tactical encirclement. All the roads are under fire. The Ukrainians can't using their own artillery to suppress Russian artillery, and the disaster has already started. This is the first thing. The second thing is that the Ukrainians are trying to make some kind of media manipulations, trying to keep the situation stable. So, as we discussed, as I told you yesterday, that if the Ukrainians took a decision to step back, then the next 3 days we would see some kind of stable evacuation, and as soon as the number of forces in Bakhmut will be reduced till 5,000, then we're going to see a mass and balagan of evacuation process in Bakhmut. So maybe that was some kind of media manipulation to save and to stabilize the situation and not to allow the collapse of entire front line, and not to allow the Ukrainian forces who located in Bakhmut to do whatever they want and to start running from their position. So this is the second option that we can discuss. And the third option is that Ukrainians took a decision to stay in Bakhmut because they understand and they're planning to start these days another offensive operation. And this is also a very interesting opinion, because most of the Russian experts are saying that these days the Ukrainians, as we discussed during the first phase of evacuation, moved from Bakhmut the most powerful, the most experienced parts of Ukrainian army. Some sources are saying that the Ukrainians replaced those forces with territory defense forces, with old men, with young men, unexperienced. But anyway, no matter their experience, no matter their age, the Russians needs time before they are able to reduce these forces. And anyway, this is the kind of barrier that the Russians need to cross before continue their offensive operation. So the Ukrainians, and this is very interesting version, because we talk a lot, and the Western countries and NATO countries talk a lot, and the Ukrainians talk a lot about the upcoming greatest Ukrainian offensive operation. And of course, if we try to create some kind of configuration, the front lines and so on, the best time to attack the Russians is while they're completely involved into Bakhmut offensive operation, because there are a lot of artillery systems, there are Wagners around Bakhmut, there are, let's say, intelligence completely works on Bakhmut, trying to understand and to provide the Wagner's necessary information. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians are able to attack, let's say, from the south, and let's say the Ukrainians are able to continue their offensive operation on Kupyansk front line. And maybe some Russian sources are saying that the Ukrainians will try and will do both these attacks from the north and from the south, because we see that the level of losses of Ukrainians on the northern front lines like Kupyansk and Liman are very high, but we don't see the progress on the ground. And this is very interesting. Why there are so heavy losses, but we don't see any progress? Maybe because of the fact that the Ukrainians managed to accumulate a lot of forces there, and they're just waiting for an order to start offensive operation. And when talking about the south, if we take a look at the deployment map, you're gonna see that a lot of mechanized brigade were redeployed in direction of Dnipro and Zaporozhye, maybe to fulfill this. There are like 63rd Mechanized, there are 60th Mechanized Brigade, there are 71st Jaeger Brigade, there are a lot of brigades in the south, like 65th. So there are a lot of forces that Ukrainians are able to use to start offensive operation and to in direction of Melitopol. So this is the third option why the Ukrainians took a decision not to step back from Bakhmut, and now the Ukrainians are trying to pin down and freeze the Russians' reserves in the vicinity of Bakhmut and not to allow them to be flexible. Furthermore, we understand that if the Ukrainians start offensive operation on the north or on the south, the Russians will be forced to change the configuration of their reserves, and they will change the configuration of their logistic, because from that moment the Russians will be forced to pay more attention to the south by providing them more artillery shells, by providing more reserves and manpower, and this will, of course, this will affect the situation, the Wagner positions around Bakhmut. They will feel the lack of artillery shells and so on. And of course, their progress will be slowed down very much, and maybe the Wagners won't be able to have any progress from that moment until the Russians repulsed the Ukrainians' greatest offensive operation from the north or from the south. Anyway, as the Western countries were saying, in March they're going to be the beginning of the Ukrainian greatest offensive operation, or maybe the Russians. Can't tell you exactly, but something is going to happen. So three options, one more time. The Ukrainians are no longer able to evacuate from Bakhmut. The second option, the Ukrainians took a decision to start offensive operation from the south or from the north, and it's the third option. And the second option is that the Ukrainians are doing some kind of media situation just to stabilize the situation inside the town and not to allow the entire collapsing of this area. Now let's move to the south and let's talk about Donetsk front line, Donetsk area, Donetsk city. There are a lot of very interesting updates from Avdiivka. The Russians started using actively their controlled air bombs. It's like 1,500 controllable bombs. They are able to attack this town within 40 kilometers, so this is a very big range. And these days the Russians are reducing to ruins this western flank of Avdiivka, the most fortified position with the high buildings and so on, that Ukrainians uses to pin down and to control the Russians' movements on the line between Vadiana and Oputne. So in this area, as you can see, there are no changes in the ground, but some sources are saying that the Russians are very active on this front line. The Ukrainians reported that during the previous 24 hours, I'm talking about the yesterday and the day before yesterday, the Russians made 55 attempts of storming Avdiivka from many directions: in direction of Severnaya, Tonenka, in direction of Krasnogorovka, in direction of Novokalinovo, Novobakhmutovka, in direction of Kamyanka. And the Ukrainian sources published a lot of video and photo confirmation of their own artillery attacks against the Russian convoys and columns that were attacking these positions, but for now no progress on the ground. But something tells me that maybe within the next few days we are going to see more piece of news about the Avdiivka and about the Russian progress. Also, there might be anything might happen there. We might see the real progress as we saw in Bakhmut, or maybe we can see the disaster as we saw in the vicinity of Uledar. The Russians reported, when talking about the South Donetsk area, the Russians reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 65 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems, 1 Uragan and 1 Grad system. Furthermore, the Russians managed to spot and discover another raider and TPQ-37 that were destroyed on this front line as well. When talking about Zaporozhye, there are no changes. There's artillery duels and so on. There is some interesting update that according to some Russian military authorities, the Ukrainians managed to accumulate in this area somewhere between, let's say, Dnipro River and Velika Novoselovka around 35,000 soldiers. So this is the situation about the possible options why the Ukrainians are not leaving Bakhmut. Not just because they want to fight there or fight till the last Ukrainians, they need to freeze and pin down the Russians there, and meanwhile to attack them somewhere in Zaporozhye. Very interesting and Let's see what is going to be next. When talking about Kherson, the Russians reported that as a result of previous clashes, the Ukrainians lost 11 armored vehicles and just one artillery system, Akatsiya. And there are no more progress. As you can see, this is the first days since the beginning, maybe the middle of January, when the Ukrainians haven't lost soldiers on this front line, just armored vehicles and artillery systems. So, and that's it about the situation on the ground. One more time, no changes on Kupyansk. Liman continuing offensive support operation. Bakhmut, very difficult, complicated situation. There are three options that we discussed. Donetsk, the Russians start actively attacking Avdiivka using new types of weapon they have, and they are very active in this front line. And Zaporozhye, the Ukrainians accumulated up to 35,000 soldiers that they may use to start offensive operation in direction of Melitopol. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.